Get out of my clinic, and don't come back until you're someone we can respect." My stepfather's voice carried across the waiting room, loud enough that 2 patients looked up from their magazines. I stood there with my laptop bag over one shoulder, my badge still clipped to my blazer, and I felt my face go hot in front of strangers. "You're 34 years old," my mother said, not even bothering to lower her voice. "Playing with computers instead of building a real career. It's embarrassing." I didn't argue. I'd learned a long time ago that arguing only gave them more to work with. I unclipped my badge, set it on the reception counter, and walked out into the parking lot without looking back. 3 weeks later, they walked into a boardroom in downtown Toronto for what they thought was a routine pharmacy benefits meeting. And the first thing they saw was my name on the glass door. My name is Vivian, and I was 34 years old when my mother and stepfather decided I was the family failure. It hadn't happened in one conversation. It built up over almost a decade, the way damp gets into drywall before you ever see the stain. My mother, Eleanor, had been a pharmacist for 30 years at the same independent pharmacy in Mississauga. And my stepfather, Gerald, had retired from a logistics company with a pension and a habit of telling people exactly what they should have done differently. Between the 2 of them, there was a very specific idea of what a respectable life looked like. A degree, ideally 2. A title you could say out loud at Thanksgiving without people asking follow-up questions. A pension plan. A LinkedIn photo in a blazer. My younger half-brother, Theo, checked every one of those boxes. He had an MBA from a school my mother could name drop, a director title at one of the big banks downtown, and a habit of mentioning his bonus at exactly the volume needed for the whole table to hear. Whenever my aunts or cousins came around, Theo became the centerpiece of the conversation. "Tell them about the promotion," my mother would say, glowing, and Theo would oblige, modest on the surface and thoroughly pleased underneath. I sat through years of these dinners with a quiet smile, because the alternative was making a scene, and making a scene was its own kind of failure in that house. The truth was, I dropped out of my master's program in computational biology when I was 26. Not because I'd failed a single course. I'd actually been near the top of my cohort, but because I'd started building something on the side that mattered more to me than finishing a thesis nobody outside academia would ever read. It began as a tool I wrote for myself, a way to help small medical clinics manage patient scheduling and prescription renewals without the chaos of 3 different software systems that didn't talk to each other. I built the first version in my apartment in the East End, surviving on instant noodles and a credit card I am still slightly ashamed of. Nobody believed it would go anywhere, including for a while me. But it did go somewhere. Slowly, then less slowly. A clinic in Etobicoke signed on. Then a small chain of physiotherapy offices. Then 18 months in, a regional pharmacy network that needed exactly what I'd built scaled up. I stopped telling my family about it after the 2nd year, because every update was met with the same polite, distant nod. The kind you give a child, showing you a drawing of a horse that looks more like a dog. Easier to just let them assume. And they did assume. My mother told her sister I was still figuring things out. My stepfather referred to my work, when he referred to it at all, as Vivian's little app thing. The thing that always struck me, looking back, was that neither of them ever actually asked. Not once in 8 years did my mother sit across from me and say, "What exactly are you building, Vivian? Tell me about it." The assumption was easier than the question. Assumptions don't require you to update your opinion of someone. It came to a head on a Sunday in early spring at a family dinner at my mother's house, the kind with a roast and good wine and 17 unspoken rules about who gets to speak when. My Aunt Josephine, who I actually liked, turned to me partway through the meal and asked, kindly enough, "So, Vivian, what is it you're doing these days, work-wise?" Before I could answer, my mother let out a short laugh. "We're still waiting to find out ourselves." A couple of people at the table chuckled, the way people do when they're not sure if it's a joke. I felt my jaw tighten, but I smiled anyway, because that's what I always did. Gerald leaned back in his chair, wine glass in hand, and said, "Some people work for years to build a career. Theo's worked hard for what he has." The comment wasn't subtle. It was aimed directly across the table at me, and everyone at that table knew it, including Theo, who suddenly became very interested in his potatoes. I should have said something then. I didn't. Silence in that family was usually read as agreement, and that night it only encouraged them further. "You know what your problem has always been," Gerald continued, warming to the subject now that he had an audience. "You quit the second things got difficult. The program, the thesis, all of it. You've never finished anything in your life." The table went quiet in that specific awful way where you can hear the furnace running. My mother shook her head slowly, the picture of disappointment. "Such a waste of a good mind," she said. "You were always the smart one, and look where it got you." Then Gerald said the thing I will never be able to fully forget, even now, even with everything that came after. "Honestly, Vivian, next to your brother, you're an embarrassment to this family. Uneducated, unemployed, and 34. We didn't raise you to end up like this." Nobody at that table moved. My Aunt Josephine actually put her fork down. I looked at Gerald, waiting, genuinely waiting, some small foolish part of me still hoping for him to hear what he'd just said out loud and walk it back. He didn't. He doubled down instead. "If the truth is too much for you to hear, maybe it's time you found somewhere else to stay." I should explain that part. I'd been staying at my mother's house for 6 weeks at that point, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because the condo I'd bought downtown the year before, with cash, with money they had no idea existed, was being renovated, and my mother had offered the guest room before the offer turned into a weapon. They didn't know about the condo. They didn't know about a lot of things. My mother crossed her arms over her cardigan. "Maybe it really would be best if you found your own place, Vivian, for everyone's sake." That was it. No further discussion. No apology. No softening. No one in that room willing to even glance toward walking it back. I stood up from the table, folded my napkin with what I remember as unnerving calm, and went upstairs to pack the one duffel bag I'd brought with me. I didn't slam the door. I didn't say anything dramatic on my way out. I just left, the cold spring air hitting my face on the front step like something almost merciful. Over the following 3 weeks, I moved my things into the finished condo. Granite counters, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the lake, the kind of place that would have made my mother's eyebrows shoot up if she'd ever bothered to ask where I lived. I threw myself into work. We were in the middle of finalizing the biggest contract in the company's history, a partnership with one of the largest pharmacy benefit networks in Ontario, the kind of deal that would put us in front of clinics and pharmacies across 3 provinces. I didn't call my mother. She didn't call me. The silence didn't even feel like punishment by that point. It just felt like clarity. Then, in a turn neither of us could have orchestrated, if we'd tried, my mother and Gerald received an invitation to a partnership information session downtown, an event for independent pharmacy owners and senior pharmacists being courted into a new software rollout. My mother had spent 30 years building relationships in that world, and an old colleague had passed her name along without a second thought. The invitation promised a tour of the company's offices, a presentation from leadership, and a catered lunch. Naturally, given the chance to dress up and be courted by a company. Everyone in the pharmacy world was suddenly talking about. They accepted. 3 weeks after telling me to find somewhere else to stay, my mother and Gerald walked into the glass-fronted office tower at King and Bay, the kind of building Gerald used to point at from the GO train and say, "Now that's where real money lives." A receptionist greeted them with a clipboard and a warm, professional smile and led them up to the 17th floor. They followed her down a hallway of glass-walled offices, past a kitchen with a barista station, Gerald would later mention twice, and stopped in front of a large corner office with a door that had a name etched into the frosted glass. My mother read it once, then again. Then she stopped walking entirely. The receptionist, oblivious, smiled and said, Ms. Whitfield is expecting you both, right this way." Gerald blinked. I'm sorry, Vivian Whitfield? The receptionist checked her tablet, slightly confused by the question. Yes, our CEO. You're here for the pharmacy partnership session, correct? My mother's voice came out smaller than I had ever heard it. There must be some mistake. No mistake, the receptionist said pleasantly, and opened the door. I was standing near the window with a tablet in hand, reviewing the morning's agenda with my Shiwo, when the door opened, and I looked up to find my mother and stepfather frozen in the doorway, like two people who had walked into the wrong funeral. My mother's hand had gone to her chest. Gerald's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again with nothing coming out. For a moment, none of us said a word. Then I smiled, the kind of smile I'd practiced in boardrooms 100 times by then, and said, "Good morning. Glad you could make it." The silence that followed was somehow worse than anything that had been said at that dinner table 3 weeks earlier. Before either of them could find words, the rest of the room began filling in behind them. My head of partnerships, 2 senior reps from the pharmacy network, my CFO with his usual stack of printouts. The meeting started whether my mother and Gerald were ready for it or not. And they found themselves quietly steered into chairs near the back, 2 unexpected guests at a meeting that had nothing to do with them and everything to do with the daughter they'd told to find somewhere else to live. For the next hour, I ran the presentation. I walked the room through our growth numbers, our expansion into Quebec and the Maritimes, the new compliance framework we'd built specifically for independent pharmacies, like the one my mother had spent her entire career at. Partners spoke up about how the platform had changed their patient retention. Our CFO mentioned, almost in passing, the revenue figure for the previous fiscal year, a number that made Gerald's pen stop moving against his notepad. My mother sat very still throughout, her hands folded in her lap, watching me the way you watch, something you suddenly realize you've never actually seen before. This wasn't a side project. This wasn't Vivian's little app thing. This was a company with 41 employees, offices in 2 cities, and a client list that included people my mother had spent 30 years trying to impress. When the meeting ended and the room slowly emptied, my mother and Gerald stayed in their seats, the way people stay seated after a flight has landed, because they're not entirely sure their legs will work yet. The door closed. For the first time in 3 weeks, it was just the 3 of us. My mother spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. Vivian. I waited. She looked around the office, the view of the lake, the awards on the shelf, the framed first dollar from our very first client taped crookedly beside the window, and then back at me. Why didn't you ever tell us? I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the answer was so obvious it ached. I tried, I said. For years I tried. Neither of them spoke. You never asked what I was building. You never asked if I was happy. You only ever asked when I was going to get a real job. Gerald's shoulders dropped in a way I'd genuinely never seen before. All that certainty he carried into every family dinner, every lecture about what real careers looked like, seemed to drain out of him right there in that chair. We thought, he started. I know what you thought, I said, and I meant it kindly, which surprised me more than it surprised them. You thought a degree was the only road that led anywhere. You thought if it didn't come with a title you could repeat at Christmas, it wasn't real. My mother looked down at her hands. We were wrong, she said quietly. I was wrong. My brother Theo arrived about 20 minutes later. Somebody had clearly called him the moment my mother and Gerald walked out of that boardroom in shock, and his reaction was nowhere near as dramatic as theirs. If anything, he looked almost relieved. I always figured there was more to your story than what Mom and Gerald let themselves believe, he said, glancing around the office with something between admiration and amusement. This explains a lot, actually. For the first time in 3 weeks, I laughed, a real one, and some of the tension in the room finally eased, not all of it, but enough to breathe in. Eventually, Gerald stood, smoothing down his jacket in a gesture that looked almost involuntary. I owe you an apology, he said, and the words sounded foreign coming out of him, like a language he'd never practiced. I judged you without ever once trying to understand you. That was wrong of me, Vivian. My mother nodded beside him. So did I, she said. I let what other people thought matter more than what was actually true. I appreciated it. I want to be honest about that. I did appreciate it, more than I expected to. But an apology, even a sincere one, doesn't erase 8 years of being made to feel small at your own family's dinner table. It just acknowledges that it happened. As they were getting ready to leave, my mother paused at the door, her hand resting on the frame the same way it had when she first read my name on the glass. We're proud of you, she said. A year earlier, even 6 weeks earlier, those 4 words would have undone me completely. I'd waited my entire adult life to hear them. But standing there in my own office, with my own name on the door and my own life built without their blessing, I realized something had shifted in me without my noticing exactly when. The words still mattered. They just didn't matter the way they used to. Not because I'd stopped caring about my mother, but because I'd finally stopped needing her permission to know who I was. After they left, I went back to my desk, and the meetings for the afternoon carried on exactly as they would have on any other day. The contracts still needed signing. The Quebec expansion still needed a launch date. Life, in other words, simply continued, the way it does. Sitting there that evening, the lake going dark outside my window, I understood something I don't think I could have explained to anyone at that dinner table 3 weeks earlier. Success was never about proving Gerald wrong or making my mother regret the things she'd said. Success was building a life sturdy enough that their approval, when it finally came, felt nice but no longer necessary. The strangest part of the whole thing wasn't watching my mother and stepfather discover who I'd become. It was realizing that I had already become it, quietly, on my own, the moment I stopped trying to make them see it.